morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to talk to you at the Sustainable Road Freight Workshop this year. My name is Kovacs. I'm the ERCO professor in humanitarian logistics, and by that it's probably quite obvious what I'm going to talk to you about today. So the topic for this session is greening humanitarian logistics, and I'll go through a few distinct issues. One is operational constraints in the humanitarian environment, as to say, like, what is it that you face as challenges? What is different? What are the issues that we have to consider, especially when it comes to greening? Another thing is climate change and humanitarian logistics, a bit of the interactions of like, how do the two a bit influence one another? And last but not least, obviously, greening these kinds of operations and greening humanitarian logistics overall. But let me start really by saying, like, what is the aim that we are after? Usually in humanitarian logistics, the big aim is to deliver aid and to save lives, to sustain livelihoods. The biggest consideration we start with, though, is first, do no harm. This is the very same thing as the Hippocratic Oath. Unfortunately, it's not something that is very obvious to everybody, but in any case, it's something super important to keep in mind. Now, first, do no harm is mostly meant for saving and sustaining human life, but what we are trying to argue for is that this is also to be extended to the natural environment. So what is it with humanitarian logistics and what is freight in humanitarian logistics? You can see the exactly same types of vehicles and vessels and airplanes and so forth as you would see everywhere else, except of course this particular one is a very rosy picture. It doesn't quite look like this in our operations. Rather, this is a bit more typical. You would have dirt roads. This is actually a really nice one. You actually even still see where the roads should be going. That's not always the case. And you do have to think of like the vehicles that can function on these kinds of roads. I'm just boring you with a few pictures of a few operations I've been in myself. This is also from Nepal still, again, dirt roads, just to see also like kind of the types of vehicles, the types of traffic that you're looking after. Okay, the type of traffic can be a lot more intense. This is from floods, and a very typical thing in floods is to have then these kinds of barges that are used to deliver in the last mile. And why am I talking about it? Well, you might have dirt roads, but you might also just not have a road. And obviously what we are talking about are situations in which you deal with conflicts or with all sorts of different types of natural hazards, very often hydrometeorological hazards. So you do have a really big issue with the infrastructure then as well. Just a bit of a flavor still to bringing stuff across a flood. So what are our operational conditions overall? Well, first and foremost, disasters and conflicts themselves typically destroy transport infrastructure. And they do it in many different ways. I mean, flooding is obviously one way, even just, airfields and ports that are dilapidated would be another thing. Which kinds of vessels or which kinds of planes can still actually get to a particular point is going to be a question. Railroads are very typically destroyed, and you might also see very extremely rarely rail transportation in humanitarian logistics because of that, because it just takes a while to restore the infrastructure again. So these are really big questions there. But when I'm talking of issues of access and accessibility, it's not only the transport infrastructure we're talking about, it's also like, if you have, say, seasonal floods, can you actually get through it to particular locations? Can beneficiaries get to you? And who of the beneficiaries can get to you? Because at the end of the day, you're trying to serve the most vulnerable people, often in the most remote locations. So this is not somewhere like in the commercial sector where you can say, that doesn't pay off anymore. No, in the humanitarian sector, the whole idea is that you need to go the extra mile. So while we are thinking about access and accessibility, and while we are thinking about restoring transport infrastructure, in the meantime, the vehicles we use need to be able to operate on many different types of road conditions, and quite strange ones, sometimes in the mud, sometimes on a dirt road. Now, why is that such a big challenge? Very often you'd face a situation in which a vehicle, like any kind of very fancy new truck, just cannot operate with the kinds of conditions that we are talking about. Or your truck breaks down somewhere on the road. There is no way you can send somebody to maintain it, but you actually would need to have vehicles that the drivers themselves can repair. You also often talk about convoy situations. Both in conflicts you have that, but also in just some more remote locations you would have convoys, in order to be able to help one another if something happens. Security can be an issue in that sense as well, especially in conflicts. So to bear in mind that whatever you can yourself then maintain and have the ability, the capacity, but also like trucks that actually let you do that, that's usually a plus. And sadly, that's often very old trucks that we are talking about then. At the same time, we have a speed imperative and urgency imperative that we need to observe. I mean, after all, we are talking about saving lives. Now, at the same time, when coming back to first do no harm, there is a very important aspect here of right items first. Because if you especially have choking points that are already overwhelmed, or that can only take very limited capacity at any time, you don't want to choke the pipeline as well with items you can't use. And in fact, we've seen this many times when it's not very well thought through what is the highest priority. You may end up in situations in which ports and airports are clogged with all sorts of things that in the end are just going to be thrown away or even incinerated, because you need to get rid of these items and free up capacity again. But there are things one can do, and one can do the exactly same way as in the commercial sector. There is modal choice. There are other options, even though typically everybody wants to fly in their first items. That is not necessarily a must. Definitely one could send things by sea. It's possible to rehabilitate ports and railway tracks. If you think of it, recently we've seen actually quite interestingly and very fast rehabilitations of railway tracks, for example, in Ukraine. So it is possible, and where there is a will, there is a way. That said, and here you have a map on that, sometimes there is no will. We can calculate how sea basing would work and how quickly a vessel would reach particular destinations, what it would actually then mean for you in terms of like the quantities that you can bring in instead of like air freight, which is usually rather limited. But what we've also run into when we did our sea basing research is that oftentimes when something is not considered fast enough, it's also not considered suddenly humanitarian aid anymore. It's a really interesting way of how you have to deal with governments and explain it to them that, well, just because you brought it by sea, it's no less humanitarian aid, and it should not be then stuck in customs forever. So that's a bit of a challenge that we have to live with, and we would need to tackle. And definitely this needs a lot more understanding also from governments, that just because you have a so-called slower mode that you're using, it's no less important what you bring in. Another thing one can do, and this has to do with, for example, the seasonal floods I mentioned, is that it is possible to pre-position or to mobilize something before a disaster strikes. We can use meteorological forecasts, and we do use them. We also know quite often that with seasonal floods that then a season pretty much would start. So one can actually activate the whole supply chain beforehand, which again also means that you don't need to then suddenly fly in goods, because you could have already just brought it in by road, or you don't have to bring in people in a very complex manner if you can just do it and send them in early on. This is being done in floods. It's also being done in hurricanes. The bigger picture is, if you just think of it, okay, how does climate change though now impact on disasters? And we have a few distinct impacts we are observing. One is how patterns of particularly now hydrometeorological hazards keep on changing. And with patterns, we mean both the frequency, the timing, the impact, but actually also the location. So while we do consider, for example, meteorological forecasts for deployments in humanitarian logistics, these forecasts need to kind of be revised, and we don't quite have a way yet to bring in climate change risk into these forecasts. At the same time, there is something called forecast-based programming, which also means that you do act the moment you see that something may come up and may be happening. Another thing, if you just look at this bigger picture, is that there are links between, for example, climate change to climate migration, to displacement, to conflict. So it's not only extreme weather events and their patterns that we are talking about. We do have a lot of cascading impacts on various also secondary locations. We do talk then about supply chain disruptions. We might sometimes even talk about pandemics, and this figure is actually from a moment when we did now have the COVID pandemic, like how these things also to some extent come together. So what is it that we can then do? When we do talk about greening humanitarian logistics, there is a lot of activity in the area of prevention and mitigation. So the same ideas that you are now talking about otherwise about build back better are also very present here. Build back better may also mean building back sometimes in different locations. It might mean that you build back with different materials or are preparing for different types of disasters next. A very good example here would be building back communities in Australia, where sometimes the location is changing, looking at, okay, where do the cyclones usually head and where is the biggest flood risk? Having said so, it's not always a possibility. You can't move communities from floodplains every time. Sometimes your entire country is a floodplain. So it would actually create huge migration and conflicts if you suddenly moved out communities everywhere. But another thing you can do is you can make obviously smarter and greener choices in aid. And now I'm talking about what is it that we bring out, how do we package them? Is the package something that needs to be thrown away? Can it be used for something else? Are we collecting it again, and so forth? Even like what is needed in the first place, because it's not always a given that that what you decide that should be brought out is what is actually needed. Reducing the needs overall is a big thing. There we talk about local mitigation, even like the build back better aspect is a bit of reducing the needs in the future. So those are kinds of things that go hand in hand. Fairly new in the sector is to talk about waste management and about reverse logistics. We've just finished a project on that, and it's been quite interesting to get into that discussion. I'll come back in a second to it. Other things that are happening are really like systemic changing. And let me highlight two things here. One is cash programming, which means that you actually don't deliver items, but you deliver money or financial means to people, which is quite a known concept, I think, otherwise under social welfare, but you can do that in disasters just as well. It also means that the people who get that money can themselves decide what they actually need, how much they need of it, and so forth. This would change volumes of what you're delivering, and it also may change distances. In the same vein, localization of aid has very similar aspects to the fact that instead of actually importing items to a disaster area, you would try to focus on what can you buy locally, what is being manufactured locally, what does the local market already have. So again, we are talking about changing quantities, as to say volumes, and distances in freight delivery. Just a few sentences about our RAC project. So this was the one in waste management and reverse logistics, together with the logistics cluster, which is mostly a coordinating body across humanitarian organizations in logistics, and it was together with numerous partners from humanitarian organizations. We were trying to look at, like, okay, what kind of waste streams is it really that we talk about? How can they tap into any kind of circular economy or reverse logistics mechanisms in the countries where these items are delivered to? And how do those kind of mechanisms actually then look like? The same thing with reverse logistics. The big question is, like, what is it actually that you're bringing back? What do you want to collect? Who collects it? In which format? And so forth. And there are a few waste streams that have been highlighted, particularly in this project. One is particularly now packaging waste, but also kind of just all sorts of types of plastic waste as a waste stream. And typically the discussion is about water bottles, and obviously you never want to actually deliver water bottles if you can avoid it. Plus, water is just heavy to deliver. You usually want to rather restore and rehabilitate water and sanitation infrastructure instead. But there is a lot of other plastic also being brought out, both as packaging materials, but even as, like, for example, tarpaulins in shelter toolkits. The other big waste stream that we've highlighted that is very problematic is medical waste, which is often incinerated for hygiene reasons as well. But there is a lot of a discussion, like, who should collect it and how should it be collected, also to avoid items ending up on the market and that might be already having broken a cold chain, or that might have had expiry issues and thereby would cause other problems to human health. So these are lots of things that we are looking into now. Again, back to the bigger picture, where do we stand with a lot of these considerations? So humanitarian logistics, if you really think of it, the basic mandate is to deliver aid. It comes, of course, with questions of performance and accountability, but basically we just need to be able to deliver. A bit more recently, the systemic changes of local procurement, localization have come in, and as said, greening operations, cash programming, and waste management and reverse logistics are fairly recent issues we are dealing with. But then there's a lot more, and we haven't quite gone through it. Like, when you look at, for example, water footprints, or nowadays the big discussion about the biodiversity footprint of supply chains, we are nowhere close to a discussion there yet. On the other hand, let me also just remind you that whenever you have these systemic changes, for example, in cash programming, I have personally been in one situation where we had to stop cash programming and go back to importing food to a country because the country had run out of food and no amount of cash would have any beneficiary to actually get it and access it. So basically what it comes to it is, while we are considering all these other things, the basic mandate of humanitarian logistics is still there and it doesn't go away, and that is to be able to also deliver. Thank you so much. This is just a short overview from me on greening humanitarian logistics. I will also be there for your panel discussion a bit later, so stick around and come to the panel debate. Thank you.